Hi, my name is Dimitri Usanen, and today I'm going to talk to you about the attacks and defenses on collaboratively trained machine learning models. So let's begin by introducing the collaborative learning methods. So the first one you're very well familiar with, which is the centralized data aggregation approach, where all the data gets aggregated at a single site and all the algorithmic processing is performed there. There are some obvious problems, such as data governance and privacy regulations, lack of transparency, and the fact that some of this high-dimensional data may be expensive to transfer to the main site. As a result, two approaches were proposed that are both decentralized, so the peer-to-peer learning approach and the federated learning approach. The idea here is that the data never leaves the local device, all the learning is performed locally, and any of the results of the computation are shared. In terms of peer-to-peer models, this happens with all the other participants. So your model gets sent to all the other participants in this kind of direction. But in a federated learning, there is a single centralized server that does all the aggregation and that performs all the further processing of the results of the computation. Both of these approaches suffer from the potential lack of trust because you can never assume the true intentions of the other people in the consortium of learners. As a result, we're trying to design a learning setting which would be resilient against as many attacks as possible. And the question we're trying to answer here is it actually possible to get to that training setting that is generic enough to apply to most collaborative learning protocols and learning tasks, as well as be protected against most attacks on collaborative learning. And the two attacks that exist in the wild are the privacy-centered attacks and the utility-centered attacks. So in this work, we particularly concentrate on the privacy-centered attacks, the one that try to expose the information that you did not want exposed. And the examples of this are membership and attribute inference attacks, model inversion, etc., etc. The utility-centered attacks, however, try to undermine the integrity of the trained model. They're trying to introduce collateral learning tasks. They're trying to hinder the performance of the model in specific underrepresented subgroups, etc., etc. The examples of this would be backdoor attacks or model poisoning attacks. So in this work, we consider two different variations of the model inversion attack. So what the model inversion attack does, it captures some internal representation of the trained model or the model in training, and it uses this information to try to leverage it to reconstruct certain sensitive information about the training data. The first implementation is the generative decoder attack. This was originally used as a collaborative inference attack. We've also modified the threat model to potentially also include the aggregation server in federated learning. It is of note that here, in addition to federated learning, we also use the concepts of split learning, where the model is trained to a specific layer on site locally, and then the rest of the computation is performed on a centralized server. And the results of the first part of the model are sent to the aggregation server. That allows to reduce the amount of information transferred, as well as reduce the amount of information available for the adversarial server. So for model inversion, our threat model would be white box access, honest but curious, because neither the malicious participants nor the malicious central server would be able to do anything with the learning context itself. All they do is they try to infer the information they aren't supposed to infer. So the results of the attack can be seen on this slide. They are pretty effective when it comes to capturing data of low dimensions. However, when it comes to more complex data sets, in this case, even CIFAR 10 or CIFAR 100, the attacker may experience certain difficulties when the models are too large, but more on that later. The second attack that we test here is the deep leakage from gradients. And the idea here is that the client or the central server that's been compromised captures the gradient shared by another participant. And this gradient corresponds to an image that the participant uses to train the model. And what the adversary tries to do is they replicate the dimensions of the target image. So because they're one of the participants of the central server, and they try to perturb the image that they control, i.e. the noise, to match the gradient that they captured. So the gradient that they capture at some point after you perturb the image for long enough time will match what the adversary is trying to replicate. And the results of this attack are pretty impressive. Within 40 or 50 iterations, you can already get not just the outline of what the training data looks like, but in some cases, the exact reconstruction of the image used to train the model using this reconstruction method. The second type of attack that we deploy is the membership inference attack. So the adversary has access to a single data record, and they wish to determine if this data record was part of the training data set. Which could mean severe privacy violations when we talk about disease data sets in healthcare. They have black box access to the trained model, and they're trying to predict using the confidence interval that the model produces based on the data record that they supply it with, if this record was indeed part of the training data set or not. In this work, our main contribution is the concept of model adaptations. So these are easy to implement empirical measures that could be seen as the slight changes that you need to make in the collaborative learning protocol in order to reduce the effectiveness of most privacy-based attackers. So by these, we mean trivial things such as the width of the models, the layers that you use, batch sizes, whether or not to use noisy labels, specific normalization strategies, etc., etc. The slight teaser is that they do work. If you look at on the right hand side of the picture, the left hand side is the generative decoder attack on Cifata without adaptations, and the right hand side with adaptations. I'm going to briefly present some noteworthy results. So for the decoder attack, we found that increasing the width of the convolutional layers presented the attacker with more data that they could utilize to reconstruct the images. And if the model is pretty shallow, if there isn't enough width, then the attacker may struggle to obtain meaningful representations. And as you can see on the bottom left, there are different variations based on which activation functions you use and which pooling layers you deploy as well. For this specific attack, we found tanh to be detrimental to the attacker, and we found that max pool is also detrimental to the results of the attack. Now, when we discuss these results, it's important to put them into context of the deep leakage from gradients, because contrary to the previous ones that we just discussed, here you have a little bit of a narrow window where if the model is too simple, it doesn't memorize the data well enough. But if the model is too complex, then the adversary is going to struggle with the reconstruction procedure. This is particularly noticeable for convolutional layers. And for the fully connected layers, we found that this is a single-sided limit, that the model can get too complex for the adversarial optimizer to try to figure out what was the training data, but there is no lower limit that we are aware of. And as you can see on the bottom, this attack gets mitigated in full. Unlike the generative decoder, there is no partial reconstruction. There's no background dissection. There is no way to determine what was the training record. It's just the noise that you end up with. For membership inference, the results are slightly different. So for convolutions, the wider the model is, the more successful the adversary gets, because there is more information they can leverage. At the same time, this does not hold true for the fully connected layers. There is no clear correlation between the width of the fully connected layers and the results of the attack. And we also, as a little extension, compared our experiments against formal privacy-preserving protocols, such as differential privacy. And we found that by selecting the hyperparameters correctly, by selecting the architecture, by being very careful with our threat model, we were able to obtain models that are resistant against these types of attacks, without the associated utility penalty that you normally see in differentially private deep learning. Here is just a bit of a visual overview. So this is the DLG attack. The reconstruction was run on the pneumonia prediction dataset by Kamani, resized to 32 by 32 and 64 by 64. And you can see precisely that neither the DP trained model nor the model trained under model adaptations was vulnerable to this attack. Here is a little TLDR, the results. As you can see, the big problem here is that there is no unified solution to all three attacks at the same time. And these are just 3 attacks out of many, potentially 20 different types that the adversary can leverage. So can we mitigate even those 3 with a specific architecture and a set of model adaptations? No, we cannot. But the point here is that we can significantly reduce the attacker's surface and completely mitigate certain attacks in full, while also slightly improving the robustness against other types of adversaries. However, this research doesn't stop here, because between when this work was submitted and now, there were many different attacks that were developed. Some attacks, such as the generative decoder, are now more or less obsolete because split learning is not as popular as it used to be. But the trends mostly remain the same. So the conclusions that were reached on the width and the complexity of the model, as well as the data, can still be applied to the more modern implementations of the attack. The future work that we are currently investigating is, can we obtain a very similar study on model poisoning and backdoor attacks? And the TLDR is yes, we can, but again, there are complications when it comes to assessing what exactly contributes to a better or worse attack, which are the 2 main challenges associated with this work, because there are simply too many adaptations for us to consider, and the number of attacks proposed over the last 2 years is extreme. These are just the different variations of DOG, some of which are actually able to mitigate our model adaptation defenses, particularly the final 3. Finally, we've during our work on model inversion, we've produced a number of contexts, clinical ones, which were vulnerable to deep leakage from gradients and its advanced versions. This is actually true for image segmentation models, as well as for the classification models. Some of you may recognize the BRATS dataset on the right-hand side. This is just a big showcase of the fact that no model is safe by default, and privacy should be included in the learning context, particularly a collaborative one, from the ground up, if you don't want to obtain the results that look like this during your collaborative training. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions or proposals, please feel free to email me.